The lobby of the Crescent Bank smelled like polished marble and old money. It was the kind of place where whispers echoed and footsteps announced themselves before their owners appeared. On the morning of March 7, 1984, that carefully maintained silence shattered into something else entirely. By noon, 4 people had walked out with nearly $2 million, and by nightfall, they had vanished so completely it was as if they had never existed at all. Atlanta was a different city then. The skyline still reached upward with ambition, but the streets below moved to a slower rhythm. Downtown still belonged to businessmen in wool suits and secretaries in practical heels. The Crescent Bank sat on the corner of Forsyth and Madison, a 3-story building of limestone and confidence that had weathered the Depression and 2 world wars without flinching. People trusted it the way they trusted sunrise. They believed their money was safer there than anywhere else in the city. Detective Warren Calloway had worked robbery for 11 years when the case landed on his desk. He was 43 then, with a face that had learned to hide its disappointments and hands that still shook slightly when he thought too hard about the war he had left behind in another country. He had seen plenty of bank jobs. Most were desperate, sloppy affairs that ended in arrests within 48 hours, junkies with notes scrawled on napkins, gamblers trying to outrun their debts, angry ex-employees looking to settle scores. This one felt different from the first briefing. The robbery itself had been elegant in its simplicity. 4 individuals entered separately over the course of 20 minutes. They wore business attire that blended perfectly with the mid-morning crowd. No masks, no obvious disguises, just unremarkable faces that witnesses would later struggle to describe with any precision. One of them, a woman with dark hair and a navy dress, had opened an account at the information desk, while the others positioned themselves near the teller stations and the vault access corridor. At exactly 11:15, when the vault was open for its scheduled morning transactions, they moved. There were no weapons displayed, no shouting, no panic. The woman at the information desk produced a small device that looked like a radio, but emitted a piercing frequency that disrupted the bank's alarm system. Another produced identification that appeared authentic enough to convince the head teller to open the secondary cash reserves. The precision suggested months of planning, inside knowledge, and a level of coordination that spoke to military or law enforcement training. Within 12 minutes, they had filled 3 leather briefcases and 1 canvas bag with bundled currency. They walked out through separate exits, climbed into vehicles that had been left running in carefully chosen locations, and disappeared into the Atlanta traffic like smoke dissolving into air. The bank manager, a man named Herbert Lowell who had worked there for 27 years, sat in the empty lobby afterward with his head in his hands. He kept saying the same thing to the responding officers. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. His voice cracked on the repetition, as if saying it enough times might make the whole thing make sense. The investigation began the way all investigations begin, with questions that seemed simple but rarely were. Who had access to the vault schedules? Who knew the security systems well enough to disable them? Who needed $2 million badly enough to risk everything? Warren Calloway and his partner, a younger detective named Iris Pembroke, started building files. They interviewed every employee, every regular customer, every vendor who had serviced the building in the past 6 months. They pulled records and cross-referenced schedules and looked for patterns in the chaos. What they found, or rather what they did not find, troubled them more than any evidence could have. There were no obvious suspects, no disgruntled employees with gambling debts, no recent terminations with grudges, no security guards with sudden unexplained absences. The 4 individuals on the surveillance footage were ghosts. The cameras had captured them, yes, but the images were frustratingly generic: dark hair or light hair, average height or slightly above, features that could belong to 1,000 different faces. The identification used to access the vault had been convincing enough in the moment, but proved to be expertly forged when examined later. The vehicles had been stolen days earlier from different parts of the city, then abandoned in locations carefully chosen to leave no forensic trace. Weeks became months. The leads that seemed promising in the beginning dissolved under scrutiny. A tip about a man seen with unusual amounts of cash turned out to be a lottery winner. A suspicious transaction at a car dealership belonged to a doctor who had sold a vacation home. The investigation began to lose momentum the way investigations do when every door opens onto another empty room. The task force was reassigned. The file grew thicker, but no closer to resolution. Warren Calloway kept working it in the margins of other cases, but even he began to accept what no detective wants to admit. Some crimes remain unsolved not because the investigators fail, but because the criminals succeed. The people of Atlanta eventually stopped talking about it. The Crescent Bank installed new security systems and hired additional guards, and reassured its customers that such a thing could never happen again. Herbert Lowell retired early and moved to the coast. Life continued forward because life always does, carrying its mysteries along like stones in a riverbed, smoothed by time but never quite forgotten. The 4 people who walked out with $2 million vanished so completely that Warren Calloway sometimes wondered if he had imagined them. He would pull the surveillance footage late at night and watch those unremarkable faces move through the lobby with such calm certainty. He studied their body language, searching for some tell, some nervous gesture that might reveal a weakness. There was nothing. They moved like people who knew exactly what came next, who had rehearsed every step until it became muscle memory. They moved like people who had already become someone else. Years passed. Warren Calloway retired in 1991. He moved to a small house near Stone Mountain with his wife, and tried to fill his days with fishing and woodworking, and all the things retired men are supposed to enjoy. But certain cases stay with you. They live in the back of your mind like unfinished sentences, waiting for a period that never comes. He kept a copy of the file in a box in his garage. Sometimes he would open it and look at those blurred faces and wonder where they had gone, if they were still together, if they felt guilty, if they ever thought about the people they had deceived and the lives they had disrupted, if they slept well at night, or if the weight of what they had done followed them into their dreams. The answer came from an unexpected direction, the way answers often do when you have stopped looking for them. In the summer of 2003, nearly 2 decades after the robbery, a man named Gerald Thorne sat in a bar in a small town called Riverside, 3 hours north of Atlanta. He was 58 years old, with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested a life spent mostly indoors. He had lived in Riverside for 14 years. He owned a small bookstore on Main Street that specialized in used mysteries and local history. He was known as quiet, polite, someone who kept to himself but was always pleasant when approached. He had no criminal record. He paid his taxes. He attended the occasional town council meeting. He was, by all appearances, exactly who he claimed to be. But alcohol has a way of loosening the seams that hold false identities together. Gerald Thorne had been drinking steadily for 3 hours when a conversation at the bar turned to unsolved crimes. Someone mentioned a recent documentary about a famous heist in New York. Someone else brought up a local legend about a train robbery from the 1800s. The stories grew taller, and the laughter grew louder, and Gerald Thorne, who had spent 19 years being careful, said something he should not have said. He mentioned Atlanta. He mentioned a bank. He mentioned a morning in March when everything went exactly according to plan. He said it casually, almost as if he were recounting something he had seen in a movie rather than something he had lived. The words came out wrapped in the fog of whiskey and nostalgia, and for a moment, no one really registered them. but one person did. A woman named Claire Hobson, who worked as a paralegal in Riverside and had a memory for details that bordered on photographic. She had seen a documentary years ago about unsolved robberies. She remembered the Crescent Bank. She remembered the date. She remembered the amount. Claire Hobson did not confront Gerald Thorne that night. She went home and searched online until she found old news articles about the robbery. She read them twice, then called the Riverside police the next morning. The officer who took the call was skeptical at first. Cold cases from 2 decades ago did not usually break because of drunken confessions in small-town bars. But he made a note. He filed a report. He sent an email to the Atlanta Police Department with the relevant details and a request for any active investigators on the case. The email sat in an inbox for 3 days before anyone noticed it. Most of the original task force had retired or moved on. But Iris Pembroke, who had been Warren Calloway's partner all those years ago, was still working cold cases part-time as a consultant. She saw the email. She recognized the case number. She felt something shift in her chest, a small electric jolt of possibility that she had not felt in a very long time. She picked up the phone and called Warren Calloway. He was 72 by then. His wife had passed the previous winter. He spent most of his days alone in the house near Stone Mountain, reading books he had always meant to read and taking long walks that led nowhere in particular. When Iris called and told him about the email from Riverside, about a man named Gerald Thorne who might have said too much after too many drinks, Warren felt something he had not felt in years, not quite hope, but something close to it. A sense that the unfinished sentence might finally find its ending. They drove to Riverside together on a Tuesday morning in late August. The town was smaller than either of them expected. A single main street lined with storefronts that looked like they had not changed in 50 years. The bookstore was easy to find. It sat between a hardware store and a diner, its window display filled with faded paperbacks and hand-lettered signs advertising local author events. Warren and Iris stood outside for a moment, looking through the glass at the man behind the counter. He was reading, his head bent over a thick hardcover, his gray hair catching the afternoon light. He looked peaceful. He looked ordinary. He looked like someone who had left his past so far behind that it could never catch up. But the past always catches up. That is the thing about time. It does not erase. It only accumulates. Warren Calloway had learned that lesson in a jungle overseas, and he had spent the rest of his life watching it prove itself true in 100 different ways. He pushed open the door. The bell above chimed softly. The man behind the counter looked up. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or fear, or resignation. The look of someone who had been waiting for this moment even as he hoped it would never come. Warren introduced himself. He used his old title, detective, even though it no longer technically applied. Gerald Thorne set down his book slowly. He did not ask why they were there. He did not pretend confusion. He simply nodded, as if this were an appointment he had forgotten but always knew was on the calendar. The three of them stood in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by stories of crimes solved and mysteries unraveled, and the silence stretched out like a held breath, waiting for someone to break it and let the truth finally spill free. Gerald Thorne did not move from his position behind the counter. His hands rested flat on the worn wood surface, palms down, as if he were steadying himself against something only he could feel. The bookstore smelled like old paper and dust, and the faint residue of coffee that had been sitting too long in a pot somewhere out of sight. Outside, the afternoon traffic of Riverside moved past with the unhurried pace of a town where nothing much ever happened. Warren Calloway watched the man's face and saw the careful mask of 14 years beginning to crack at its edges. Iris Pembroke closed the door behind them. The bell chimed again, softer this time, almost apologetic. She had always been better at reading people than Warren, better at knowing when to push and when to wait. She said nothing now, just positioned herself near the window where she could watch both the street and the interior of the shop. The silence expanded to fill the space between them, heavy with the weight of years and choices and consequences that had waited patiently for this exact moment. Gerald Thorne finally spoke. His voice was quiet, roughened slightly by age or perhaps by the effort of holding something inside for so long. He said he had always known someone would come eventually. Not known in the sense of certainty, but known in the way you know that gravity will eventually pull everything back down to earth, no matter how high it climbs. He said there had been nights when he would wake suddenly, convinced he heard footsteps on the stairs outside his apartment above the bookstore, mornings when he would open the shop and half expect to see police cars waiting on the street. The fear had faded over time, worn smooth by the passage of ordinary days, but it had never entirely disappeared. It lived in him like a low-frequency hum that he had learned to ignore but could never quite silence. Warren asked him to start from the beginning. Not the robbery itself, not yet, but the time before. Who he had been when he still went by his real name. Gerald Thorne nodded slowly. He turned the sign on the door to closed and locked it with hands that trembled just slightly. Then he sat down in one of the worn armchairs near the mystery section and began to speak in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, a place he had spent 19 years trying to forget. His real name was David Kellerman. He had been born in Augusta in 1945, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher who believed education could overcome anything, even poverty. He had done well in school, well enough to earn a scholarship to Georgia Tech, where he studied engineering and graduated near the top of his class. He married a woman named Linda in 1968. They had a daughter named Sarah the following year. He took a job with a defense contractor in Atlanta, designing systems for aircraft navigation. The work was steady and the pay was decent, and for a while everything looked like it was going to work out the way the American dream promised it would. But money has a way of revealing fault lines in foundations that looked solid. Linda's mother got sick with cancer in 1976. The medical bills piled up faster than insurance could cover them. David Kellerman took out loans. He borrowed from friends. He worked overtime and took on consulting projects and watched his savings evaporate like water on hot pavement. His marriage began to fracture under the pressure. Linda started drinking. Their daughter Sarah struggled in school and developed anxieties that required therapy they could barely afford. David Kellerman looked at his life and saw a structure collapsing in slow motion, and no matter how hard he worked or how carefully he planned, he could not find a way to stop it. That was when he met the others. He said it carefully, as if the words themselves were fragile. He did not offer names at first, and Warren did not push. The story came out in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 2 decades. There had been 4 of them. They had all worked for the same defense contractor at different times. All had security clearances. All had access to information and systems that most people never saw. They had met through work, bonded over shared frustrations about pay and management, and the feeling that they were building weapons systems for a government that did not care whether they could afford to feed their families. The conversation started casually, the way dangerous conversations always do. Complaints became fantasies. Fantasies became plans. Plans became preparation. It took them almost 2 years to organize everything. They studied the Crescent Bank because one of them, a woman named Valerie, had worked there briefly in college and remembered the layout. They learned the schedules, the security protocols, the shift changes. They practiced their roles until they could execute them without thinking. They forged identification documents using equipment stolen from the contractor facility. They acquired the device that would disrupt the alarm system by modifying radio equipment they had legitimate access to. Everything was planned with the same precision they had used to design navigation systems for fighter jets. They treated it like an engineering problem, something to be solved through careful analysis and flawless execution. David Kellerman said he had justified it to himself in a dozen different ways. He told himself the bank was insured, that no one would really get hurt, that he was only taking what he needed to save his family. He told himself he would pay it back someday when things got better. He told himself lies that sounded like truth when spoken in the desperate hours of 3 in the morning, when he could not sleep for worrying about the next bill, the next crisis, the next piece of his life that was about to crumble away. He told himself anything except the simple fact that what he was planning was theft, pure and calculated, driven not by sudden desperation, but by months of careful deliberation. The robbery itself had gone exactly as they had planned. That was almost worse somehow, the fact that their precision had been rewarded with success. They had walked out with close to $2 million divided among 4 people. They had separated immediately, each taking their share and heading in different directions with instructions never to contact each other again. David Kellerman had gone south initially, then west, then eventually north to Tennessee, and finally here to Riverside. He had changed his name legally through a service that specialized in helping people disappear. He had dyed his hair, changed his style of dress, altered his speech patterns. He had become Gerald Thorne completely, burying David Kellerman so deep he sometimes forgot the man had ever existed. He had used some of the money to pay off his mother-in-law's medical debts anonymously. He had sent cash to his wife through an intermediary, with instructions that she was to tell no one where it came from. He had watched from a distance as Sarah graduated high school and started college. He had given up his right to be part of their lives because he knew his presence would only bring questions he could not answer. The money had bought them stability, but it had cost him everything that mattered. That was the trade he had made, and he had lived with it for 19 years, telling himself it had been worth it even though he knew it had not been. Warren Calloway listened to all of this with the expression he had perfected over decades of interrogations. His face revealed nothing. Inside, he felt something more complicated than anger or satisfaction. He felt a kind of tired sadness for the waste of it all, for the lives that had been bent and broken by choices that could never be undone. He asked about the others. David Kellerman, who was still getting used to being called by his real name again, shook his head. He said he had kept his word. He had not contacted any of them. He did not know where they were or what names they lived under now. He did not know if they had stayed together or scattered. He had no way to reach them even if he wanted to. Iris Pembroke spoke for the first time since entering the shop. She asked if he regretted it. David Kellerman looked at her with eyes that had grown tired from carrying secrets. He said he regretted it every single day. Not just the crime itself, but everything that had led up to it. Every small compromise and rationalization that had brought him to that morning in March when he walked into the Crescent Bank and stopped being the man he had thought he was. He said he had rebuilt a life here in Riverside, a quiet life that hurt no one, but it was built on a foundation of lies, and he had always known that someday the ground would shift and everything would come down. The interrogation, if it could even be called that, continued for another hour. David Kellerman answered every question with a kind of weary honesty that suggested he was relieved to finally stop pretending. He provided details that only someone who had been there could know. He described the inside of the vault, the way the head teller had looked when presented with the forged identification, the exact route they had taken through the city streets afterward. He told them about the car he had driven, a stolen Chevrolet that he had abandoned in a long-term parking lot at the airport before switching to a rental under a false name. He told them about the months of anxiety that had followed, waiting for the knock on the door that never came, slowly beginning to believe he might actually get away with it. Warren asked him what had made him slip at the bar that night. David Kellerman smiled without humor. He said it had been the combination of whiskey and time and the simple human need to be known. He had spent 19 years being Gerald Thorne, a man who had no history before he appeared in Riverside, no stories worth telling, no past worth remembering. He had been drinking and listening to other people talk about their lives, their adventures, their moments of recklessness, and something in him had rebelled against the erasure of his own history. For just a moment, he had wanted to be real again. He had wanted someone to know that he had existed before Riverside, that he had done something significant even if that something was terrible. It had been stupid and selfish and completely human. The question of what happened next was complicated. David Kellerman had committed a serious crime 19 years ago, but the statute of limitations for bank robbery was typically 5 to 7 years, depending on federal versus state charges. Warren was not entirely sure if prosecution was even possible anymore, and he was not a practicing detective with the authority to make arrests. Iris Pembroke made phone calls. She contacted the Atlanta Police Department and the FBI field office that had been involved in the original investigation. She explained the situation carefully, laying out what they had found and what it might mean for the case that had haunted them for nearly 2 decades. The legal machinery began to move slowly. Agents arrived in Riverside 2 days later. They interviewed David Kellerman again, this time with lawyers present and recording equipment running. They searched his apartment and the bookstore. They found financial records that showed a man who had lived modestly for years, never spending in ways that would attract attention. They found journals that documented his guilt and his attempts to rationalize what he had done. They found photographs of a daughter he had watched grow up from a distance, newspaper clippings tracking her life through the fragments available in public records. The story broke in the media within a week. The Crescent Bank robbery had been famous enough in its time that its resolution, even partial, made national news. Reporters descended on Riverside. They interviewed Claire Hobson, the paralegal whose memory had sparked the investigation. They talked to townspeople who had known Gerald Thorne as a quiet bookstore owner and were struggling to reconcile that image with the man who had helped steal $2 million. The coverage was intense but brief, burning hot for a few days before moving on to newer stories. For the family that David Kellerman had left behind, the revelation was devastating in ways that had nothing to do with the crime itself. Linda Kellerman, who had remarried years ago and now went by Linda Morrison, spoke to investigators with a mixture of anger and confusion. She said she had always wondered where the anonymous money had come from, the cash that had appeared at her lowest moment and allowed her to pay off debts that had been crushing her. She had convinced herself it was some kind of mistake, a bureaucratic error in her favor, something she could accept without questioning too deeply. Learning the truth felt like a betrayal layered on top of the original abandonment. Her husband had not died or simply left. He had become a criminal and then a ghost, watching her from the shadows while she rebuilt her life with money that was never his to give. Sarah Kellerman, who was now 34 and working as a teacher in Columbus, refused to speak to reporters. She released a brief statement through a lawyer saying that she had believed her father was dead for most of her life, and that his reappearance as a confessed criminal did not change that fact in any meaningful way. She had no interest in contact or reconciliation. The man who called himself David Kellerman was a stranger who shared some genetic material with her, nothing more. The coldness of the statement was its own kind of devastation, a door closing with finality on any hope of redemption or forgiveness. The question of the other 3 participants remained unsolved. David Kellerman's cooperation had provided investigators with descriptions and partial information, but it was not enough to locate people who had spent 19 years constructing new identities. The FBI opened new case files. They cross-referenced databases looking for matches. They interviewed former co-workers at the defense contractor, trying to identify who else might have had the skills and opportunity to participate. The investigation was active again, but it was like trying to find 3 specific grains of sand on a beach. The passage of time had given the others what David Kellerman had lost through his moment of weakness in a bar, the chance to remain hidden. Riverside itself struggled with the aftermath. The town had been proud of its anonymity, its status as a place where nothing much happened, and everyone knew their neighbors. The revelation that one of those neighbors had been living under a false identity for 14 years shattered something. People began to wonder who else might be hiding secrets. The bookstore closed permanently. No one wanted to run it, and the building sat empty with Gerald Thorne's inventory still inside, mysteries and histories gathering dust in the dimness. The bar where David Kellerman had made his confession became briefly famous, then settled back into obscurity, its owner tired of answering the same questions from curiosity seekers. Warren Calloway returned to his house near Stone Mountain, with the satisfaction of having finally closed a case that had haunted him, but the satisfaction was more bitter than sweet. He had wanted to believe that solving the mystery would provide some sense of completion, but instead it just revealed more sadness. A man who had thrown away his life and his family for money he had barely used. A wife who had survived on stolen cash without knowing it. A daughter who had lost her father twice, once to his crimes and once to the truth about those crimes. There were no winners in this story, just people who had made choices and lived with the consequences until those consequences finally caught up. He kept the case file even after everything was documented and filed officially. Sometimes he would open it late at night and look at the surveillance photos from 1984, those blurred faces moving through the Crescent Bank lobby with such confidence. He would think about the 3 who were still out there somewhere, living under names that were not their own, carrying secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. He wondered if they had heard about David Kellerman's capture. He wondered if they lay awake at night now, waiting for their own moments of weakness to betray them. Iris Pembroke retired for the 2nd time after the case concluded. She said she was done with cold cases, done with the weight of other people's mistakes. She moved to Charleston to be near her grandchildren, and tried to fill her days with things that had nothing to do with crime or investigation, or the long shadows that old cases cast across lives. But she kept Warren's number in her phone, and they talked occasionally, 2 people bound by shared history and the strange satisfaction of having seen something through to its end. The Crescent Bank, which had long since been absorbed into a larger financial institution and rebranded, issued a statement expressing satisfaction that one of the perpetrators had been identified. The money was never recovered. David Kellerman claimed to have hidden his share in various locations over the years, spending it slowly and carefully, never keeping large amounts in any one place. By the time of his arrest, most of it was gone, dispersed into the anonymous economy through small transactions that left no trail. The bank's insurance had covered the loss decades ago. The money itself had become almost irrelevant, a ghost of its own. Time continued its relentless forward motion, because time does not care about resolution or justice, or the ways people try to make sense of what cannot be made sense of. Riverside returned to being a small town where nothing much happened. Atlanta continued to grow and change, its skyline reaching higher, its streets filling with new people who had never heard of the Crescent Bank robbery and would not care about it if they had. The case files were archived in databases and storage facilities, available for anyone who wanted to study them, but mostly forgotten by a world that had moved on to newer crimes and fresher mysteries. David Kellerman pleaded guilty to federal charges that could still be prosecuted due to some technical complexities involving interstate flight and fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years, reduced due to his cooperation, and his age and his lack of any criminal history before or after the robbery. He would serve his time in a minimum security facility and likely be released early for good behavior. It was a small price for what he had done, but then again, he had already paid a larger price in the years he had spent as someone else, cut off from everyone he had loved, living in a kind of voluntary exile that was its own form of imprisonment. There was a certain symmetry to it all, Warren Calloway thought. The crime that had been executed with such precision had unraveled through a single careless moment. The man who had planned so carefully to disappear had betrayed himself through the human need to be remembered. The investigation that had seemed hopeless had finally closed through a combination of persistence and chance. It was not the ending anyone had imagined back in 1984, when 4 people walked out of a bank with $2 million and vanished into history. But it was an ending nonetheless. In the autumn of 2004, more than a year after David Kellerman's arrest, a hiker in the Appalachian foothills stumbled across something unusual while exploring an area of Tennessee forest that had recently been damaged by storms. Fallen trees had exposed a section of earth that had been undisturbed for years, and there, wrapped in deteriorating plastic, was a leather briefcase that had survived better than anyone would have expected. Inside were stacks of currency, still bundled, along with a driver's license bearing a photograph and a name that investigators recognized from the Crescent Bank case. The discovery suggested that at least one of the other participants had hidden their share rather than spending it, perhaps planning to retrieve it eventually, or perhaps simply unable to bring themselves to use money that represented the destruction of everything they had been. The briefcase was processed for evidence. The bills were confirmed as matching serial numbers from the robbery. The driver's license was identified as belonging to one of the defense contractor employees who had left their job abruptly in March of 1984 and was never seen again. Iris Pembroke called Warren when she heard about the discovery. She did not say much, just asked if he had seen the news. He said he had. They sat on the phone in silence for a moment, 2 retired investigators contemplating what the briefcase meant, another thread of the story revealing itself. Another piece of evidence that someone out there had tried to walk away, but perhaps had not made it as far as they had hoped. The forest gave up its secrets slowly, and maybe there were other briefcases buried in other places, or maybe this was the only one. There was no way to know. The FBI expanded their search of the area, but nothing else was found. The money was logged as recovered evidence. The case file was updated. The investigation into the remaining 3 participants continued in theory, though everyone involved knew the chances of finding them after 20 years were remote at best. They had learned from David Kellerman's mistake. They would be more careful. They would take their secrets to graves that might never be found. Warren Calloway was 73 years old when the briefcase was discovered. He had survived a war and a career, and the loss of his wife, and the slow accumulation of years that had worn him down to something harder and more resigned than the young man who had once believed every case could be solved if you just worked it hard enough. He knew now that some mysteries stayed mysteries, not because the answers did not exist, but because the world was large and people were good at hiding and time eventually buried everything. But he also knew that the world was small in unexpected ways. That people carried their pasts with them no matter how far they ran. That secrets had weight, and that weight eventually became unbearable. That a single moment of weakness or bad luck or desperate need for connection could unravel years of careful planning. David Kellerman had proved that. The briefcase in the forest suggested it might be true for the others as well, so Warren kept the file. He kept his phone number active. He stayed ready in case another call came, another piece of the puzzle revealing itself from wherever it had been hiding. He did not expect it to happen. But he had learned long ago that expectation and reality rarely aligned, and that sometimes the cases you thought were finished had a way of surprising you with one more chapter, one more revelation, one more chance to bring something that had been hidden into the light where it could finally be seen for what it was. The years that followed David Kellerman's conviction moved with the strange dual quality of time that marks the aftermath of long-dormant cases finally broken open. For some, the resolution brought a kind of peace, however incomplete. For others, it opened wounds that had scarred over but never truly healed. The discovery of the briefcase in the Tennessee forest had raised more questions than it answered, and those questions became a kind of ghost that haunted the remaining days of everyone who had been touched by the case. Warren Calloway found himself thinking about the briefcase more often than he wanted to admit. The fact that someone had buried their share of the money and apparently never returned for it suggested a story that had ended badly. The driver's license inside had belonged to a man named Thomas Ridley, one of the four who had worked at the defense contractor and disappeared in the spring of 1984. The FBI had conducted searches of the area, brought in cadaver dogs, used ground-penetrating radar to scan for any sign of human remains. They found nothing. Thomas Ridley, or whoever he had become, remained as absent as he had been for 2 decades. But the discovery had reignited something in Warren that he thought had burned out years ago. He began going through the old files again, not with the systematic approach of an active investigation, but with the more intuitive method of a man trying to understand a story rather than solve a crime. He read the original witness statements until he could recite them from memory. He studied the backgrounds of all 4 suspects, looking for patterns, for connections that might have been missed in the initial investigation when everyone was focused on the mechanics of the robbery itself rather than the people behind it. Thomas Ridley had been 31 at the time of the robbery, unmarried, with aging parents who had reported him missing 6 months after he disappeared. He had been described by coworkers as quiet, competent, someone who kept his personal life private. His parents had died within a few years of each other in the early 90s, still believing their son might one day walk through the door with an explanation that would make sense of his absence. Their deaths had closed that possibility, leaving Thomas Ridley, wherever he was, completely untethered from the identity he had abandoned. The woman who had opened the account at the information desk, the one David Kellerman had called Valerie, proved more difficult to trace. Records from the defense contractor showed a Valerie Marsh who had worked in the security division for 18 months before leaving in February of 1984, just weeks before the robbery. She had been 29, with a degree in computer science from a state university and a work history that suggested competence but not brilliance. She had no criminal record, no financial problems that appeared in any database, no obvious reason to risk everything for a share of stolen money. The 4th participant remained the most mysterious of all. David Kellerman had been unable to provide much detail about him, saying only that he had gone by the name Marcus and had been the one to initially propose the idea of the robbery during a conversation that had started as bitter humor and gradually transformed into something more serious. Marcus had been the oldest of the group, somewhere in his mid-40s at the time, with skills that suggested military background. He had known how to plan operations, how to coordinate timing, how to think through contingencies. He had been the architect of the whole thing, according to David Kellerman, the one who had turned a fantasy into a feasible plan. Iris Pembroke, despite her stated retirement from cold cases, found herself drawn back into the mystery as well. She had moved to Charleston with the intention of leaving all of this behind, but the discovery of the briefcase had disrupted that intention. She began making phone calls, reaching out to contacts in various law enforcement agencies, asking questions about unsolved disappearances and unidentified remains from the mid-'80s. She was not officially working the case. She had no authority and no budget. but the work itself had become a kind of compulsion, a need to see the story through to whatever ending it might have. What she discovered was a pattern that was both disturbing and sadly mundane. The years following 1984 had seen dozens of people disappear in the southeastern United States for reasons ranging from intentional flight to foul play to simple misfortune. Many had eventually been accounted for. Others remained on missing persons lists that no one looked at anymore. Cross-referencing those lists against the age ranges and physical descriptions of the 3 remaining suspects produced a handful of possibilities, but nothing conclusive. People who vanished intentionally were often very good at staying vanished. In the spring of 2006, nearly 3 years after David Kellerman's arrest, Iris received a phone call from a detective in Asheville, North Carolina. He had been reviewing old missing persons cases as part of a cold case initiative and had come across a file that seemed potentially relevant. A woman named Helen Carr had been reported missing in October of 1984, just 7 months after the Crescent Bank robbery. She had been living in a small apartment outside Asheville, working as a bookkeeper for a local manufacturing company. She had no family in the area, few friends, and her disappearance had not been considered particularly suspicious at the time. It was assumed she had simply moved on without telling anyone, something that happened often enough not to warrant extensive investigation. But the description in the file matched what they knew about Valerie Marsh: similar age, similar build, similar professional background. The Asheville detective had run a comparison of the photographs on file and thought there was enough resemblance to warrant a closer look. Iris drove to Asheville with Warren, both of them understanding that this was likely another dead end, but unable to ignore even the slimmest possibility. The apartment where Helen Carr had lived was long gone, demolished years ago to make way for a shopping center. The manufacturing company had closed in the late 90s, its records scattered or destroyed. The few people who remembered Helen Carr at all recalled her as quiet, professional, someone who kept to herself, and rarely engaged in the casual social interactions that defined workplace relationships. No one had known much about her past. She had provided references that checked out and credentials that appeared legitimate. She had done her work competently and without complaint. When she stopped showing up, the company had assumed she quit and eventually hired someone else. The one significant detail that emerged from the investigation was that Helen Carr had closed her bank accounts and withdrawn all her savings in cash 2 days before she disappeared. It was not a large amount, less than $3,000, but the action suggested planning rather than sudden impulse. Whatever had happened to Helen Carr, she had prepared for it. Iris and Warren sat in a diner in Asheville after spending 2 days chasing fragments of a woman who might or might not have been Valerie Marsh. The coffee was weak, and the afternoon light coming through the windows had that quality of autumn that makes everything look slightly faded. Warren said what they were both thinking: they might never know what happened to these people. The 3 who had not been caught might have lived long lives under different names, might have died in accidents or from illness, might have successfully become other people so completely that their original identities were nothing but faint echoes that would never be heard again. Iris stirred sugar into her coffee and said that maybe that was its own form of justice, not the kind that happened in courtrooms, but the kind that happened in the private moments when you had to live with what you had done. David Kellerman had spent 19 years unable to see his daughter, unable to build real relationships, unable to exist as his true self. That was a sentence more profound than anything a judge could impose. Maybe the others had experienced something similar. Maybe the weight of their secrets had crushed them in ways that were invisible from the outside. They drove back to Atlanta in silence, watching the landscape shift from mountains to foothills to the flat approaches to the city. The case remained open in the technical sense, but both of them understood that it would likely never be fully solved. Some stories did not have complete endings. Some mysteries stayed mysterious not because answers were impossible, but because the world was too large and time too long, and people too capable of disappearing when they truly wanted to. David Kellerman served 3.5 years of his sentence before being released on parole in the fall of 2007. He was 62 years old, his hair completely white, his face marked by the years in a way that made him look older than his age. He had no family waiting for him. His ex-wife had made it clear through her lawyer that she wanted no contact. His daughter had maintained her position that he was a stranger who happened to share her genetic material. The life he had built in Riverside was gone. The bookstore sold to pay restitution to the bank. His reputation destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. He moved to a small efficiency apartment in a town outside Savannah, a place where no one knew his history, and he could exist in the anonymity he had once sought deliberately, but now experienced as a kind of exile. He found work doing inventory for a warehouse, simple physical labor that required no background checks and no explanations. He kept to himself. He read books from the library. He walked along the river in the evenings and watched the water move past with the patient inevitability of something that had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Warren Calloway visited him once, 6 months after his release. He was not sure why he felt compelled to make the trip. Perhaps it was some need to see how the story had settled, to witness what became of a man who had thrown away everything for money that had brought him no happiness. They met in a park near the river, sitting on a bench while joggers passed and children played in the distance, and the world continued its ordinary business around them. David Kellerman said he had been thinking a lot about time and choices, and the way small decisions accumulated into lives that could not be undone. He said he had tried to trace backward through his past, looking for the exact moment when he could have chosen differently, when he might have stepped off the path that led to the Crescent Bank and everything that followed. But he could never find that single moment. It had been 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 rationalizations, 1,000 times when he chose ease over difficulty or silence over honesty, or his own needs over consideration of consequences. The robbery itself had just been the culmination of all those smaller failures of character. He asked Warren if the others had ever been found. Warren told him about the briefcase, about the investigations that had led nowhere, about the possibility that one or more of them might have met bad ends, or might still be out there, somewhere living under names that would never be connected to their original identities. David Kellerman nodded slowly. He said he hoped they had found some kind of peace, but he doubted it. The thing about secrets that large was that they changed you fundamentally. You could not carry something like that without it altering the shape of your soul. Warren asked him if he had any regrets beyond the obvious ones. David Kellerman was quiet for a long time, watching the river move past. Finally, he said that his deepest regret was not the crime itself, but the person he had been willing to become in order to commit it. The man who had walked into the Crescent Bank that morning in March had been someone he did not recognize, someone who had silenced every moral instinct and every teaching his parents had tried to instill in him. That man had been capable of anything, and the knowledge that he carried that capacity within himself was more frightening than any legal consequence. They parted without any clear resolution, without promises to stay in touch or hopes that things might improve. It was simply two men who had been connected by circumstance, acknowledging each other's existence, before returning to their separate lives. Warren drove back to Atlanta, feeling neither satisfaction nor disappointment, just a kind of weary acceptance that this was how most stories ended. Not with dramatic revelations or perfect justice, but with people trying to live with the consequences of their choices, and the passage of time that made everything feel both more and less significant than it had seemed in the moment. The case remained in Warren's thoughts even as the years continued their steady accumulation. He turned 75, then 78, then 80. His health began to fail in the incremental ways that health fails when you have lived a long time and asked a lot of your body. He moved to a smaller house with accommodations for mobility issues. He saw less of Iris, though they still talked on the phone occasionally, two old investigators sharing memories of cases they had worked and lives they had lived. In the winter of 2012, nearly 30 years after the robbery, a woman named Catherine Wells died in a hospice facility in Raleigh, North Carolina. She was 71 years old, unmarried, with no surviving family. She had worked as a librarian for most of her adult life, living quietly and leaving behind few possessions and no particular legacy beyond the competent performance of her job. Her death would have been completely unremarkable except for one detail discovered by the hospice chaplain, who was helping to settle her affairs. Among Catherine Wells's possessions was a safe deposit box key. The chaplain, following protocol, contacted the bank and arranged for the box to be opened in the presence of the estate lawyer, handling the woman's minimal assets. Inside the box were several items that seemed significant despite their apparent ordinariness. There was a driver's license in the name of Valerie Marsh. There were photographs of a woman who resembled both the license photo and Catherine Wells as she might have looked 30 years earlier. There were newspaper clippings about the Crescent Bank robbery. And there was a letter, sealed in an envelope, addressed to anyone who might find these items after her death. The letter was turned over to law enforcement and eventually found its way to the FBI agents who had maintained the open file on the remaining suspects. They contacted Iris Pembroke as a courtesy, knowing her history with the case. She called Warren immediately. He was 81 by then, his voice thinner than it had been but still carrying the sharp clarity of a mind that had not diminished even as his body failed. She read him the letter over the phone, her own voice catching slightly on certain passages. The letter was a confession of sorts, though not in any legal sense since Catherine Wells was beyond the reach of prosecution. She wrote that she had been Valerie Marsh once, a lifetime ago, and that she had participated in the robbery with full knowledge and intent. She wrote about the months of planning, the execution of the crime, the separation afterward. She described the years that followed, living under a false identity, using her share of the money carefully and sparingly, never allowing herself to enjoy it because enjoyment felt like an admission that what she had done was acceptable. She wrote about the loneliness of living a lie, about the relationships she could never fully commit to because commitment required honesty, about the career she had built that felt hollow because it was built by someone who did not truly exist. She wrote about watching David Kellerman's arrest on the news and feeling a strange mixture of relief and terror. Relief that the story was finally coming to light and terror that she might be next. She wrote about Thomas Ridley. They had stayed in contact for a few months after the robbery, breaking the agreement they had made, but unable to entirely sever the connection to the only other people who knew the truth. Thomas had been struggling with guilt from the beginning. He had hidden his share of the money, telling her he could not bring himself to spend it. In the fall of '84, he had called her one last time. He said he was going to turn himself in, that he could not live with what they had done. She had tried to talk him out of it. The next day, she heard about a car accident on a mountain road in Tennessee. Single vehicle, driver killed, circumstances unclear. The description of the victim matched Thomas. She never knew if it was truly an accident or something else. She wrote about Marcus, the fourth member of their group. He had disappeared completely after the robbery, adhering strictly to the plan they had made. She never heard from him again, never found any trace of him in the world. She hoped he had found a way to live with himself, though she suspected that anyone capable of planning something like what they had done was probably capable of the compartmentalization necessary to move forward without looking back. She wrote that she was dying now, cancer that had started in her lungs and spread to places the doctors catalogued with clinical precision. She had weeks left, maybe days. She wanted someone to know the truth before she died, not for forgiveness, because she knew she did not deserve that, but because the truth itself had value, because someone should know that Thomas Ridley had likely died because of his guilt, because David Kellerman was not the only one who had paid a price, because all of them, in different ways, had been destroyed by the choices they made on that March morning in 1984. She ended the letter with a kind of plea. She asked that if anyone who had been harmed by their actions ever learned the truth, they would know that the harm had not been taken lightly, that the people who had committed the crime had carried it with them every day. That justice, if it existed, had been at work in ways that courtrooms never saw. She signed it Catherine Wells, but she also wrote beneath her signature the name she had been born with, as if trying to reclaim some fragment of her original self before that self ceased to exist entirely. Warren listened to Iris read the letter with his eyes closed, sitting in the dimness of his living room with the phone pressed to his ear. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Warren said that maybe this was as close to an ending as they were ever going to get. 4 people who had committed a crime together, one arrested and imprisoned, one possibly dead because of his guilt, one dead after years of carrying the secret, and one still out there somewhere, Marcus, the architect of it all, unknown and unknowable. Iris said she was going to close her file now. After all these years, after all the hours spent chasing ghosts through databases and missing persons reports and fading memories, she was done. The case would remain technically open because Marcus was still unaccounted for, but she was letting it go. She was 80 years old. She was tired. She had done what she could. Warren understood. He said he was letting it go too. He had lived with the Crescent Bank robbery for almost 30 years. It had been part of his identity longer than many marriages lasted. But he could feel his own time running short, could sense the approach of an ending that had nothing to do with unsolved cases or missing suspects. He wanted to spend whatever time he had left thinking about other things. His wife, who had been gone for more than a decade, but who still felt present in certain lights and certain memories. The cases he had solved rather than the ones he had not. The life he had lived that had been fuller and richer than the obsessions that had consumed so much of it. They said goodbye with affection, and the understanding that they probably would not speak many more times. The case that had brought them together and kept them connected across decades had finally released its hold. They were free to be just 2 old people who had worked together once and had done their best with what they were given. Warren Calloway died in his sleep on a night in March 2013. It was almost exactly 29 years after the Crescent Bank robbery, though no one remarked on the timing. His funeral was small, attended by former colleagues and a few neighbors and Iris Pembroke, who flew in from Charleston to say goodbye to her partner and friend. They buried him near his wife. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates and the word detective, which had defined so much of who he had been. Iris went through his house afterward, helping to sort through belongings that would be donated or discarded. In the garage, she found the box with the case files, the surveillance photos and witness statements, and all the accumulated documentation of a mystery that had outlived most of the people involved in creating it. She sat on the concrete floor and looked through the papers, seeing familiar faces frozen in time, seeing her own younger self in photographs from crime scenes and press conferences. She thought about burning the files, giving Warren's obsession the kind of ending that felt ceremonial and final. But in the end, she could not do it. Instead, she packed the box carefully and took it back to Charleston. She donated it to a university library that collected materials related to unsolved crimes and criminal justice history. Maybe someday, A researcher would go through it all and find something they had missed. Maybe Marcus would be found through DNA databases or genealogy research or some other technology that did not exist in the 80s when this had all begun. Or maybe the box would sit in a climate-controlled storage room forever, a record of a crime that was never fully solved and the people who had tried to solve it. The Crescent Bank building itself had been torn down in 2009, replaced by a high-rise office tower that bore no trace of what had once stood there. The Atlanta that existed in 2013 was almost unrecognizable from the Atlanta of 1984. The people had changed. The buildings had changed. The very character of the city had transformed into something faster and larger and more complex. The robbery that had once been front-page news was remembered now only by those who had lived through it, a small piece of history that would fade entirely when those memories finally disappeared. David Kellerman continued living in his efficiency apartment outside Savannah. He had no contact with investigators after Warren's death. He worked and read and walked by the river and lived the quiet, reduced life that was all that remained to him. Sometimes he thought about Sarah, his daughter who was now in her 40s with children of her own that he would never meet. He had tried once to send her a letter, an attempt at explanation or apology or something that might bridge the gap between them. She had returned it unopened. He thought about the others too, Thomas, who might have died because the weight became too much to carry. Valerie, who had died alone and left a confession that served no legal purpose but might have brought her some final peace. Marcus, whose fate remained unknown and would probably stay that way. He wondered if Marcus ever thought about them, if he felt any guilt or regret, or if he had successfully become someone else so completely that David Kellerman and Valerie Marsh and Thomas Ridley were just characters in a story he vaguely remembered hearing once. The money itself, the $2 million that had seemed like the solution to all problems, had vanished into time, some spent, some recovered, some buried in a forest and reclaimed by the state. The lives that might have been saved or improved by that money had instead been destroyed by it. That was the real crime, David Kellerman thought. Not the theft itself, but the arrogance of believing that money could fix what was broken, that a single bold act could change the trajectory of a life, without consequences that multiplied and spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. He was 70 years old when he finally received a letter he had not expected. It came without a return address, postmarked from a city he did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief handwritten message. "I am sorry for what we did. I am sorry for the cost you paid. I wish I could undo it all." It was signed with just an initial. M. David Kellerman read the letter 3 times, then walked to the river and sat on his usual bench watching the water move past. He did not know if the letter was genuine or some kind of hoax. He had no way to verify it, no way to respond even if he wanted to. But something about it felt real, felt like the words of someone who had carried a secret for decades and needed finally to release some part of the pressure that secret created. He kept the letter in his wallet, a small piece of evidence that he had not been entirely alone in his guilt, that somewhere out there was another person who understood what it meant to have destroyed your own life for a reason that made sense in the moment, but revealed itself over time to be nothing but foolishness and greed and fear dressed up as necessity. He never showed the letter to anyone. It was not evidence of anything that mattered legally. It was just a small communication between two people who had once made a terrible choice together and had spent the rest of their lives trying to understand why. The world continued turning through seasons and years that accumulated into decades. The people who had been young when the robbery happened grew old. The children who had been born around that time had children of their own. The city changed and changed again, building over its history the way cities always do, creating new stories that eventually became old stories. solving some mysteries and leaving others to fade into the background of collective memory. In the quiet moments that come to everyone eventually, when the noise of the world recedes and you are left alone with your thoughts and your memories, and the accounting of how you spent the time you were given, David Kellerman sometimes wondered what it had all been for. The planning and the execution and the years of hiding, the money that bought nothing worth having, the family he lost, the person he had been before he decided that stealing could be justified if the reasons were good enough. He never found an answer that satisfied him. But he learned to live with the question, which was perhaps its own kind of answer. He learned that redemption was not something that happened through dramatic gestures or sudden revelations, but through the quiet accumulation of days spent trying to be better than you had been, trying to cause no further harm, trying to exist in the world with some measure of humility about your own capacity for self-deception and moral failure. The sun set over the river in shades of orange and purple that looked painted. David Kellerman sat on his bench and watched the light fade and thought about time and choices, and the way stories never really ended, but just stopped being told. Somewhere out there, maybe, Marcus was watching a similar sunset, carrying his own burden, living his own reduced life. Or maybe he had found a way to be free of it all, to truly become someone else. David would never know. He walked back to his apartment as darkness settled over the city. He made a simple dinner and read for a while, and eventually went to sleep in a room that held almost nothing of value, nothing that marked him as anyone in particular. Just another old man in a world full of them, carrying secrets that would die with him, trying in the time that remained to make some kind of peace with the person he had been and the person he had failed to become. The story of the Crescent Bank robbery lived on in files and archives, and occasional true crime documentaries that presented it as one more unsolved mystery from an earlier era. Most of the people who told the story got some of the details wrong. They exaggerated the amount stolen, or simplified the motivations, or speculated about outcomes that bore no relationship to reality. But that was the nature of stories. They changed in the telling until they became something different from the truth, myths built from fragments of fact and shaped by the needs of the people doing the telling. The truth was simpler and sadder than most of the retellings suggested. 4 people had made a choice that seemed rational in the moment, and had spent the rest of their lives paying for it in ways large and small. One had been caught and imprisoned and released into a life that offered nothing but isolation and regret. One had probably died because the guilt became unbearable. One had confessed as she was dying in hopes that confession might mean something. And one remained hidden, either living with his secret or having somehow freed himself from its weight through methods known only to him. Justice, if you could call it that, had been served not through courts and sentences, but through the slow, grinding punishment of time and conscience, and the fundamental human need to be known as yourself, rather than as a carefully constructed fiction. The money had not brought happiness or security or any of the things it was supposed to bring. It had brought only consequences that multiplied and spread and destroyed more thoroughly than poverty ever could have. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that crime does not pay, which was a cliché that missed the point, but that some costs cannot be calculated in advance, and some prices are paid not in moments, but across the span of years that stretch out long after the immediate crisis has passed. The 4 people who walked out of the Crescent Bank that March morning had thought they were solving their problems. Instead, they had just traded one set of problems for another, heavier kind that could never be put down or walked away from. The river kept flowing past the city, carrying its water to the ocean the way it had for centuries before anyone built banks or invented money or conceived of crimes that seemed justified by circumstance. The sun rose and set in its eternal rhythm. People were born and lived and died, most of them doing the best they could with what they were given, some of them making choices that haunted them forever. The world turned through time that erased nothing but softened everything eventually, grinding all the sharp edges smooth, until even the most painful stories became just stories, told and retold, until they lost their power to wound and became simply part of the vast accumulated history of human failure and human endurance, and the complicated, unfinished business of learning to live with ourselves and each other, and the consequences of every choice we make.